Welcome back. So now let's continue with our outline here. We've already discussed the first two ages, Minoan and Mycenaean, and now we're going to cover these three, Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic. So after the Mycenaean period collapsed, 1100 BC, then there was a so-called Dark Age period with nothing going on in Greece anywhere. It's almost like flicking out the light switch, basically. And that lasted for about a century, down to about 1000 BC, and aspects of it really do continue down into 900 BC. And then we hear of a mysterious group of people referred to as the Dorians, who start coming in from outside of Greece, down up north, down south, and infiltrating their way through northern Greece, like through Thessaly, down filtering through Boeotia, where Thebes is, and over to the west, where Achaia is, and down further into where the Isthmus is, where Corinth is, and down finally into the Peloponnesus, and taking over all the locations such as Corinth and Argos and Sparta and so forth, all those places that existed before, and in some cases building new cities in places of whatever settlements had been there before. So Mycenaean Tiryns, its neighbor, for instance, never come back into existence, but as we said before, Argos is built on the site very close to where Mycenaean Tiryns originally were, and that becomes the important Archaic Age and Classical Age city. Okay, so these Dorians come in and basically repopulate the whole area. And you notice that I skipped a location. If you listen very carefully, you might have been aware that I didn't mention Athens. And that's because the Dorians, although they went from northern Greece down past the Isthmus into the Peloponnesus, didn't make their way over to Athens. And we can tell that very easily from the dialects of Greece that were spoken in mainland Greece versus the dialect that was spoken in Athens. The story goes that apparently the Ionians, another tribe, were chased away by the Dorians as they came in. They fled eastward over to Athens, which we know had already been built because in addition to archaeology, there's also the reference to Athens in the catalog of ships by Homer in Book 2 of the Iliad. So the Ionians came over to the eastward from the Peloponnesus, apparently fleeing these Dorians. They got on board ships at the Piraeus harbor near Athens and sailed from there out into the Aegean Sea and populated the islands and eventually the west coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and formed new settlements. And for that reason, the Athenians were able to claim a kind of supremacy, essentially politically, over all the Ionians, as saying we're kind of like the mother city. And it's in this period also that we have one of the earliest occurrences of colonization happening, of Greeks going from the mainland out into the further away islands and cities and repopulating them. That myth about the Ionian migration, however, where the Athenians rescued them from Dorians, is very dubious. We do not believe that there really was ever such a rescue operation. And still less is it acceptable that the Athenians, for that reason, deserve to have some kind of mother city or metropolis relationship with the Ionians. But it mattered a great deal politically for the Athenians that they had that kind of relationship with the Ionians that would allow them essentially to try to dictate matters to the Ionians in later political and military history, especially in the 5th century BC and down into the 4th century BC. That's going to matter big time, that the Athenians have that in their own foundation mythology. But in any event, these Dorians come in. One of the most important places that they reoccupied this way is Sparta, which of course was quite a prominent city already back in the Mycenaean days, being the kingdom of Menelaus and Helen, as is agreed upon generally. So the Spartans are reoccupied by Dorians, and they work it in their mythology that these were the children of Heracles who had been away and returned. There are two families that come back who are both descended from Heracles. These two families become the new ruling families in Sparta, and those become the two kingships that will rule over Sparta in the unique dual kingship position that becomes the government of Sparta all the way down through their history into the 4th century BC and beyond. Okay, so you have this period in which we have Greece gradually reoccupied, And we can tell from 1000 to 900 BC that we can see that new peoples are coming in and new cities are being established, because the artwork, which is called proto-geometric, it starts to appear at this time and is distinctly different from the earlier Minoan and Mycenaean artwork, especially the Mycenaean artwork that was mainland Greek art, that had very different themes. So the proto-geometric is so called because it has very simple patterns like waves that go around the pots. And then gradually, as they start getting much more complicated with the Greek key theme going all the way around and filling up the pot completely, that's when you get the much more established geometric art that becomes more important in like 900 down to 800 BC, and is especially well known in Athens because of these very large amphorae pots that were placed on tombs, these very elaborately decorated urns that were put on the tombs for people to leave offerings. Okay, so now you come from a period where you have all this heraldic Mycenaean age, with Mycenae being the chief city at that time, and Sparta also being the other really important city. All of that is now going to give way to a new form of general city-state government that's going to dominate the Greek world from the 800s BC, which is the beginning of the Archaic Age, down into the 400s, 300s, and further age, 200 BC, in these later ages. So the Archaic Age is considered to begin around 800 BC, which is the point when archaeologically and with literature, we could see the new cities having been created out of the lost period of the Mycenaeans. So in this period, we now have Homer and Hesiod's works, which are your first works of literature that you'll come across in your Harris-Platzner textbook. And you have many different cities now that are springing up and taking shape all through the Greek world. Notice again, though, that Athens was always there, as, by the way, was Sparta. So Athens can claim another thing, again, in their mythology, which is that they always occupied the same tract of land without ever being conquered and without conquering anywhere else. And so they've always been there, and that has a complicated word, autochthony, in ancient Greece, which means always occupying the same tract of land. Again, that's quite dubious historically, but it is true that there had been a city of Athens all the way through from the Mycenaean times down through the Dark Age period into the current day. So it's accurate to that extent, but the idea that politically the Athenians were always like stable in the same place at all times, again, doesn't necessarily jive with all the evidence that we have. So, okay. The Archaic period, then, is the period at which we now see the new creation of the city-state form of government. So Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, and so forth. And the word in Greece for that is the polis. So all our words in English, like political and politics and cosmopolitan and so forth, all come from that root. So the polis is the city-state that encompasses the physical city, usually walled, except for Sparta, which uniquely was not walled. So the city, the actual physical city, together with area around it that's controlled politically, and all of the political institutions in the city that would include the finance, the government, education, slavery, trade, marriage, inheritance, raising kids, and so forth. All of that all together encompasses the polis as a state, which is why we refer to it as a city-state, because it's the physical city together with all of the institutions associated with it. So Athens is one of the most important polis, that's the plural, that comes from this period, and many of the others follow suit. And by 800 BC, we have a full network of polis established all through the Greek world. So the Archaic period lasts from 800 BC down to what we refer to as classical, 480 BC. This is the period when Athens, which had been simply one of many different polis up to that point, now rises to real prominence. And that was chiefly because of the Athenians' success in the Persian Wars, when the Persians invaded a couple of decades prior to 480 BC. The Athenians actually were able to defeat them twice. The Spartans down south also did defeat the Persians a couple of times, but it was the Athenians' memorable victories at Marathon in 490 BC and Salamis in 480 BC that became the most memorable in the Greek world, and which catapulted the Athenians all of a sudden to political supremacy in the in the 5th century BC. Another thing that helped the Athenians to have this unique position was that the Athenians, because of their proximity to an important harbor, the Piraeus, and because of their ability also to trade to get a lot of timber, were able to build a mighty fleet. And in time, with the correct ideas being placed by the correct people at the right time, the Athenians eventually took advantage of all those resources and were able to turn themselves into a mighty sea power. And that made a big difference in the politics of the Aegean world and further east, and also affected the relationships the Athenians had with their other mainland neighbors, and in fact in ways that were not always so favorable as it turned out. Okay, so a lot of this is what goes on in the Archaic period. The Classical period is when Athens now becomes really, really powerful as the head of a whole network of allies. That didn't last, however. The Athenians had this network of allies, but were eventually defeated in war by the Spartans at the end of the 5th century BC. However, they rose back to power again and had another network of allies in the 4th century BC, so that's still considered classical, and this is still when the Polis system is still working. However, a lot of these Polis gradually fell to infighting, and of course there were a whole series of different wars that were always going on in one form, but finally it became so manic among all the different polis that the historian Xenophon, writing about it, says that after one especially important battle in 362 BC, one that occurred at a polis called Mantinea, a little bit north of Sparta, it was supposed to settle finally who was the leader. Instead, it did nothing of the sort. It left even more chaos after that battle than before, and that's the final statement in Xenophon's history. Well, the thing is that because of all that chaos, no one was paying attention adequately up north to the figures of Philip and Alexander the Great, who were coming in from Macedonia, and Philip observed all the chaos among the Greeks and was eventually able to play it properly as a game, and finally was able to score a military victory in 338 BC and took all of Greece under Macedonian possession. After he was assassinated a couple of years later, his son Alexander the Great repeated that process, and then of course famously went east and conquered Persia. Alexander, however, died of illness out there and left the whole area, both Greece and his new empire, in political chaos as far as leadership, and so that area broke up into these really large leagues. What effectively happened, though, with the Macedonian takeover of Greece is we see essentially an eroding of the polis system, and instead we now have the polis now grouped together into these large leagues. One of the most important of which, the Achaean League, was led by the polis of Corinth. So the leagues now have, as it turns out, much less stable leadership. There's quite a bit of division on the ranks as to exactly who's supposed to be leading which part of the Greek world when. And eventually, these Greeks start coming into contact, unfortunately, with both Carthaginians down in North Africa and then eventually the Romans. And finally, the Macedonians and Greeks make the fatal mistake of allying against the Romans with the Carthaginians, whom the Romans were able to conquer. And the Romans finally also spread eastward, and they took over Macedonia and Greece. And that's what puts an end to the Hellenistic world and effectively to Greek history. So the Hellenistic world, which is the age that ends classical in 322 BC, after the death of Alexander the Great, refers to this cosmopolitan period now when Greek culture spreads far and wide, much wider than it had been in the original mainland of Greece, and almost to an imperial state, of course, with the Athenian League. But then after that, with these really large leagues, some of which are overseen by the Macedonians, some of which are also Persian, and one important one, of course, the Ptolemaic one, that's important down in Egypt. And the thing is that although they look very strong, especially the city of Alexandria down in Egypt, many of them are vulnerable to incursion because none of them is really strong enough to build up enough protection around it to prevent a big power from eventually coming in and sweeping all of it together. And although it took quite a long time to accomplish it, that's what eventually the Romans are able to do as they build up their republic and eventually their empire. So the critical dates, 1400 down to 1200 BC is the waning period of the Minoan Age, and then 1200 to 1100 BC, the similar waning period of the Mycenaean Age. So by 1100 BC, they're both gone. And then 800 BC begins the Archaic Age, 480 BC begins the Classical Age, and finally 322 BC down to 146 BC is the Hellenistic Age. 146 BC is the year of the conquest of both Corinth and Carthage. And that is what makes Rome supreme at that point, and Greek history comes to an end. I should point out that Homer and Hesiod, our first works of literature, come from the Archaic period. The three tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, come from the Classical period in Athens. And then the works of Virgil and Ovid are Roman, but there are some elements in both of them, especially Ovid's, that can be dated to some of the Hellenistic literature. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of Hellenistic literature surviving, so we can't make the comparison very strong. But some of the Roman literature that we do have shows some elements of Hellenistic literature so that we can get a pretty good idea of what it was like. Okay, so that completes what I have to say in these actually now 3 videos on Chapter 1. And in the next video in this series, the same session, we will now turn to Chapter 2. Thank you so much, and come on right back, and we will resume with Chapter 2. See you next video.